Hello and welcome to Angular Air. Today we have a super special episode talking about Angular Universal using server-side rendering with Angular 2. And for this we have a number of spectacular panelists with us, including Olivier Combe
Hey guys.
and Patrick JS
Hey everyone.
and Ari Lerner.
Hello.
And new to the show is Wasim. Wasim, you want to give us a little bit of an intro to yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi guys, I'm Wasim. I'm a JavaScript developer based in Paris. I've been doing JavaScript since the beginning. So yeah, I've been working, contributing mainly to Universal few months back. So I'm so excited to see. Waiting for the release, May.
Nice. Yeah, Wasim has been awesome working with Patrick and I on the project, and we're going to get really into the weeds of what the project entails, how it works, all of that. But to start off with, I wanted to kind of give a little bit of history, and Patrick, definitely you can jump in here, but just to give people kind of background of how this all got started, and I'm kind of give this from my point of view, and Patrick's going to add his kind of 2 cents after that. So originally, back in the Angular 1 days, early Angular 1 days actually, I was working, and I still am working at GetHuman, and it's a consumer-facing company for doing customer service, and we had the need to rebuild our website, so a consumer-facing app, but something that, even though it was SEO heavy, where the public finding us through search engines was very important. At the same time, we were trying to add a lot of new features, real-time features, that type of thing. And at that time, this was in 2012, there actually wasn't too many great solutions for doing server rendering, for doing, universal JavaScript, isomorphic JavaScript, whatever it was. Really, it was backbone with renderer that was built by Spike Brem over at Airbnb, which was one of the options, and there really wasn't that much else. So for our stuff, I started building our own kind of custom solution with Angular 1. Like, I liked Angular more than Backbone, and I sort of used the model that Spike built with Backbone and just did it with Angular, which really meant building a completely separate rendering engine on the server side. So, just like with Backbone, it didn't really make sense to change the core framework because it was so tied to the DOM, and so many people that had built with Angular at that time built it in a way that was so tied to the DOM that it would have been extremely difficult, and still would be extremely difficult, to change Angular 1 to do server rendering within the core. So we built this kind of completely separate rendering engine that would take Angular 1 code, but then render it on the server, and it worked. That's what's actually live if you go to gethuman.com right now. And I think it was about a year and a half ago when we were just starting to get some of that into production, when in parallel, I was blogging a lot, and I posted one particular blog that Patrick just reminded me about, called Screw You Angular, talking about, after NG Europe, that there was a lot of people upset about the direction of Angular 2 and questions about it and ambiguity and that type of thing. And so Patrick reached out to me at that time when we started talking both about that article, but then we realized that we had a common interest in server rendering a lot of the work that I was doing there. So fast forward a couple months to NGConf last year, which was March of 2015? 2015, yeah. And I gave one of the talks the night before the conference started. I was like a backup speaker and talked about our Angular 1 server rendering solution. and then met up with Patrick. And Patrick had started hacking on Angular 2 and had realized that we can apply a lot of the same concepts that I had started to use in Angular 1 to Angular 2. So basically, we kind of agreed then to start working together on this. And maybe, Patrick, you can kind of pick it up from there of what happened after that.
Yeah, so like stepping back a little bit, like we met on Twitter. Like I was watching, reading your blog posts, and we got in contact on Twitter. And then at the very last minute, I wanted a ticket on NGConf, but then I flew over the next day. And I missed your talk, but I was tweeting saying that like we should meet up and talk about server-side rendering. And that's essentially like we met up, and then we were talking about like how the different approaches to server-side rendering, and how we're joking that we should do the same thing for Angular 2. And it's funny because it's like almost a year since then, so it's a good like timing for the episode. But yeah, it was great meeting, and then like a few weeks later, like I hacked up a proof of concept, and I tweeted you about that got this working, and then we should start working on it. Those are fun times, because back then it was called like isomorphic JavaScript. Now it's called like universal JavaScript. There's a name change.
Yeah, and I think that even though that initial prototype it wasn't perfect or whatever, like it didn't have full functionality that the library does today, it sort of proved the concept that this is a thing that can definitely work. So we started talking to Brad Green, who is nice enough to embrace a lot of the stuff that we were working on, and basically empowered us basically to really work this as an official thing with the tutelage of Tobias Funke, or no, what is it, Tobias? Not Funke. No, Tobias Bosch. Tobias Bosch is from the Google core team, worked with us in the early days to get this working into kind of a real thing, started the actual universal repo, and kind of we went from there. So that gives like a little bit of the history, but let's get into some of the details now. So I think the first thing that a lot of people ask is, why does this library matter at all? Like, why should I care? And actually, I'm curious, Olivier. You mentioned that you were thinking about using it for one of your projects. So, and maybe I'll ask all you guys, like, just talk in terms of use cases, like, what are the reasons why you were thinking about that you needed it?
So we will be doing our main corporate website soon, and we will use Angular 2 for that. And I want the website to be really fast at load time, and searchable by all Googles and Bing and stuff like that. Yeah, but mainly it's because I want it to be fast at startup. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, performance and SEO. Those are two of the big reasons. Wasim or Ari, did you guys have any others for like stuff that you guys have seen?
Yeah, I pretty much. There's a lot of mixed results whether or not the speed to the users is. There's a big gain on that, but I think the SEO is like. I think that's the reason why we do universal. And we do it on a lot of our in-house apps.
Yeah, I agree with you guys. The two main reasons are the user experience and the SEO stuff. Yeah, I was also thinking about maybe trying universal with progressive web apps, but this is another topic, I guess. But
well, yeah, and we'll definitely get into progressive web apps.
Yeah.
But just to finish out like some of the use case stuff, like just so we don't leave anything out. The performance and SEO are definitely far and away the two biggest issues, and we're going to dive deeper into those. But just to have the full picture, the other ones are browser support. So if you have an older browser or cater to an audience with an older browser, or ADA compliance type issues, sometimes the latest and greatest stuff out there doesn't work that well. If you've ever tried to run your Angular 2 or even Angular 1 apps on IE8 or whatever, one of those older ones, then probably doesn't work that well. And it's great that they're out of support now officially, but there's still a lot of corporations that use it, so a lot of people are still stuck doing that. So server rendering is a good fallback in those cases.
That's true. Also, client-side caching, so you can use your site completely offline, for those dead spots when you're driving across Texas and there's no towers anywhere close. Totally agreed with that.
Yep. Patrick, what were you going to say on that?
Yeah, when we met at NGConf, I remember we were talking about server-side rendering, and I was mentioning that theoretically you could support older browsers, including IE8, by switching to server-side rendering mode. Remember, in a conversation, I was saying that for IE8 support, you would use the best thing to serve for websites at the time, and that's literally just server-side rendering, right? So for older browsers, you could say, don't use any client-side JavaScript, just render everything on the server. And that's fine, that scales because your IE8 users is really just going to be 1% of your user base or 5%. So you could definitely have, its own, even a separate server just for legacy users. But you could technically support legacy users with this offline support. And that's something that that I ran into when I was doing Angular 1, is that a lot of times for IE8 users, they just want something that works, because I was working more like enterprise users, and they're locked into IE8 and they don't care about anything fancy, whatever. They just want it to work. And if you want something to work, you could just push everything onto the server. And server nowadays are just getting cheaper and cheaper by the minute. So why not just build an application that works, and without much of a buy-in, be able to support those legacy users who don't have a choice in the matter. So.
And the one caveat with this, because we try to do this with GetHuman, try to support, see if we can support these older browsers. And what I've realized, very quickly is, although it's definitely true everything that you're saying, Patrick, even with that, you run into other issues related to CSS. You have to be careful about not using the latest greatest CSS stuff if you want it to even have base level support, because some CSS stylings, if they are you depend on those for your apps, then those will still be a problem. But that said, it is possible. So yeah, that's definitely one of them. And the last one is a small one, but it actually does matter if you have a publicly facing site that you're trying to get a lot of people sharing on social media. That most social media apps have this link preview thing where they pull down the server version of your app and display it. And so if you do have a publicly facing app, that actually can be really important. And you need something that does server rendering in order to do that. I mean, that part, you can't get around. They're not going to have link preview. Not that I'm aware of features that do client-side rendering. Maybe in the future, I don't know. But right now, that definitely doesn't work. So that's for some of the use cases. So let's get into.
There is one more. There's one more. Also, for your publicly facing pages, you can host those on caching servers. So the publicly facing, after you render your publicly facing ones, you can upload those things to S3 and get the CDN, the cloud CDN, kind of for free for those pages that don't require your backend, your hefty backend.
Well, let's talk about that in a minute. Actually, I did have some of that coming later, but I think it makes sense because it's interrelated with performance. And when you say performance, there's like so many different aspects to performance and web performance. I mean, it gets to be crazy, like the initial load versus subsequent, and like what different part of the rendering cycle is causing problem. And for some of the stuff that you're talking about, Ari, you can one thing that way you could look at it is that if you have like a totally static site, let's say, something that you build with just like a build tool, static site generator, and this is not even talking about Angular, like just in general. Technically, you could regenerate your app and push it out to a CDN every 5 minutes or something like that, and see changes every 5 minutes. Or on the other side of it, you could have a dynamic website that you use edge caching, something like Cloudflare, and have Cloudflare do like a 5-minute cache. So it's still pulling from your dynamic site, but it's doing like caching the pages every 5 minutes. In either case, the user is seeing the same thing, right? They're seeing that the pages are cached between 5-minute intervals before they get changed. So there are, depending on what the particular aspects of your app are, those are kind of two different approaches of adding different performance related to page level caching. And those two, definitely you need server rendering for both, but those are kind of two different approaches.
Yep, definitely. And also you bring up the different aspects of performance. A lot of times latency matters, latency is like a perceived performance issue. So when you have your cache, and Cloudflare is a really awesome option for that as well. When you have that like edge cache available, serving those pages, you reduce a lot of that latency because it's closer to the user.
Yep, exactly.
And you can do something kind of similar with, I mean, this is getting a little bit further out, but if you want to use something like Lambda, which has CloudFront as another option, as CloudFront as a storage layer, then you kind of get that pre-rendering if you use Lambda, if you're in that space.
So I guess the key thing, and we're going to circle back to some performance stuff a little bit later in the show, but the key thing I guess I want to point out here is that there are so many different ways to make your app performant, and one of the things to realize is that today and moving forward, there's always going to be a place where server rendering can help with that. It's not going to be necessarily the main thing, but it will always be able to help with it. It's one of the questions we've gotten, especially recently, that it seems to be this kind of confusion over if you use Service Worker, you don't need server rendering. Like that's like some people are saying something like that, and it's not necessarily true, because it is true that Service Worker helps with certain aspects that server rendering does, namely if you are kind of reloading your page after an initial, you visit a site and then you reload your page, Service Worker can kind of cache a lot of your assets and then use those, so you don't have to you don't necessarily need that initial render again. But there is always going to be that first time initial render, and Service Worker doesn't help with that. You're always going to need, in my opinion, for a publicly facing site, something server-side rendered, whether it is, like we talked about, a actual cached version or something that's dynamically built at that time. It's always going to be an important part of the profile of all the things that you do for performance. Patrick, what were you going to say about that?
So now we're getting into progressive web apps, and this is a movement that the Chrome team largely has been pushing, and that usually means that there's an app shell. An app shell is just like basically a mock version of your application for the initial render without the content. Now, this is what we normally did before, Universal was more like a thing. We would always like fake the document, then the client will bootstrap and replace it. But the other aspect of progressive web apps is interacting with the service worker. Now, service worker, you think of it as a separate process that we're able to interact with, and that allows us to interact with the browser cache. And whenever we request a page, it'll hit the service worker, or HTTP call will hit the service worker, and then we can say like to serve the cache and whatnot. We can also do like push updates, etc. But for the most part, like with Universal and progressive web apps, they work together because you will definitely need to pre-render your application, and this is so you don't have to manage your application shell. And you could go one step further and pre-render your whole application inside of the service worker cache. And again, like service worker is only for latest browsers. So like this is, now we're talking about like Edge like stuff. But they work well together, and we've been working with Rob Wernhall on a Pokemon Index progressive web app example app, where it's utilizing like pre-rendering as well as service worker and everything in between, and it's super speedy. But like again, this is only for like latest browsers and everything. But the progressive web app story with Universal, it works in tandem because for the older browsers, you have server rendering only, and then for everyone else, you have the dynamic content, which is a mix between the two. And then for everyone on Edge, you get everything, including service worker and everything, and super speedy, etc. So progressive web apps, it's really just like 3 stages of users.
Did anybody else want to comment on the progressive web app stuff? I know that's a hot topic.
I think if you want to do a progressive web app, it takes a lot of work. Maybe just doing server rendering would be easier with your stuff. And then when you have the time and you want to improve really your website, you can work on advanced stuff like that. But yeah, for me, it's a bit too much.
Yeah. Yeah. What I can say, what can I add to this is, with Universal, I think you guys are making a really good job by, allowing the user to render their application server side really easily. Comparing this to progressive web apps and the topic of server workers, which in my opinion, it's a quite advanced topic, really for JavaScript gurus or so yeah. So I think they are really complementary, the two topics. So yeah.
Yeah, totally agree. One other thing I wanted to mention with this, as far as the million different things you could do to improve the performance of your app, one major advantage server rendering is always going to have is that you're dealing with a lot of different requests. Like, so it's not a single user environment and just this one user. So you have hundreds, thousands of different requests coming into the server, right? So there's a particular aspect of that that you can leverage, which is that a lot of times there is the same artifacts, different pieces of the application that are used for this every request, and you can share those. So part of that actually is built into Angular 2 Core, in fact, the way that they use proto views and the way that they're now building the pre-compiling your templates, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Different aspects of that, which now you can. Yeah, Patrick mentioning that proto views are now dead, but the point is that we can leverage the fact that one user already rendered a piece of content, and it's the same piece of content for a different user, so you get to re-leverage that. You get that for free, basically. So that's a huge advantage. And that's, for the most part, for performance, I think it's clear, unless you guys had any other points, that it definitely is an advantage. The one last thing I wanted to circle back to before we get into the universal library specifically and how it works is SEO, and I just really wanted to make one main point for that, which is that I do hear a lot about, well, the Google crawler now captures the client rendered view. Why would I need server rendering? That's like, I hear that all the time. And it is true that if your goal is to just get indexed within Google, that is mostly fine. But A, there are other search engines than Google, and they still have fairly significant traffic. So if you care about like actually ranking in any of those other search engines, Bing, whatever, they aren't nearly as good as Google. And then the other thing is that it's not perfect. It doesn't work exactly right. People that have like done this for a while will see that the client-side captured view might not be exactly what they actually want to have indexed. And the reason is that it's just hard. Like when you have a client-rendered view, there's like a lot of async stuff going on, and the crawler has to make a guess at what point to actually do the capture. Like there's no definitive way to do that, and so it makes mistakes. It doesn't necessarily support every JavaScript thing that you're doing. So the net effect of that is that, and this is not a definitive thing, I guess. This is more anecdotal from like my own experience of like fighting, search rankings for like all of our websites. Is that I have never yet seen a purely client-side driven app that is able to compete with the top rankings of a server-rendered website for a competitive set of keywords. Like it just doesn't happen. So any competitive keywords, like any search term where you're like intent on buying something, for example, you look at that, there is not a client-side rendered app among them. It just doesn't happen, and there's a lot of reasons for that, which it goes beyond this show that we can kind of talk about. If you're interested, you can ping me later, and I can maybe get into some of that. But I know, Patrick, you have a lot of thoughts on this as well.
Yeah. So like, there's really two worlds in web development, right? There's the static world and the dynamic world. We all live in the dynamic world of web applications, right? But before that, there was a static world where content was king, and still is king, and that is like CMS base and WordPress and Drupal and whatnot. Because they have a ton of content, it's kind of the reason why like their SEO is like ranked higher, because they care more about content. But with Universal, what we're really doing is merging the two worlds of the static world and the dynamic world, and that is like being able to pre-render. Now, we didn't jump into this yet, but like with Universal, you're able to pre-render your application as well as re-render your application. So not to confuse the two words, whenever we're during a request response cycle, you could re-render your application every single time there's a request, but you could also pre-render your application during build time, and then this is what Ari was talking about, pushing it to a CDN, and then hitting the cache. So you could now basically create directives for everything inside your index page. This is meta tags, title tags, anything else, and then you could also, and that's your static world, and that's pre-rendered. You put it on a CDN, but you could also include your dynamic application, which is usually like angle bracket app, and then that would also get a snapshot of your application during the pre-render cycle, during the build step, and that will be on the CDN. Now that's the what you call app shell, because it's just a shell of your application. And then when the client sends down the index page, you'll get the pre-rendered version of your application, which is just the index page, a snapshot of your dynamic application, which is just your application. Then the client-side code will kick in, and then you're now in the dynamic world. So with Universal, because we could render pretty much server, client, build step, or in a web worker even, this is really merging of the two worlds of static and dynamic. And again, like the reason why SEO is like, if you search any keywords, because in the world before dynamic, content was king, and because of that, like to win SEO, you're going to have to make a lot of good content.
Yeah. Since you talk about CMS on websites, I have a question for this. Do you think we need SEO for apps? I mean, actually, SEO is really great and useful for content for websites, for CMS. But when you're building an app, do you really need SEO for this? What's your
Certainly
opinion?
not for an internal app, but
Yeah.
if you have a consumer-facing app, so Get Human is a consumer-facing app. Like everything that we do,
Okay.
for the most part, is open to the public and viewable. And in those cases, yes, most definitely. But yeah, it is true that the SEO side of things, yeah, if you're building something internally, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's more about the performance side then in that case.
Okay.
So one thing I wanted to mention too with Patrick, what you're talking about, pre-rendering and re-rendering. Just to be clear there, it's interesting topic because there are different requirements for what you're trying to build, which sort of dictate whether you are able to use one or the other. And I feel like actually on both sides, people don't necessarily have like a good, they think they know which one their app can be useful for, but that's not necessarily the case. So like traditionally, the pre-rendered thing, like people might think it's only like a blog, let's say, where you are just publishing like once a week, right? That's like the traditional like static site generator type situation. And traditionally, most other websites fall into like the re-rendering side, like where you're rendering, on the server side every time. But that's not necessarily the case. And actually, I think it would be interesting to talk about what you've been doing at Cap One, which uses the pre-rendering, but in a very kind of interesting way.
Yeah, so I'm working with Capital One to basically use this approach of merging the two worlds, where the static world is essentially hooked up with the CMS, and the marketers can control the content and move the widgets around. But there's the dynamic part, which is many different teams. So if you look at a website, a good example is like American Airlines, where you have a ton of content there, and the only thing that's dynamic is the booking your flights, right? So booking the flights, that could be a web app, but everything else is static content. But you want the static content to be managed by marketers or someone else who can manage it. So that's usually by a CMS. And basically, the widgets that they're interacting with, that's matched up with an Angular 2 component. So that allows both sides of the spectrum to basically interact with this one cohesive world of static and dynamic, where the marketers could move stuff around, and the developer, is able to work in the same paradigm of Angular 2 components, make the widgets for the CMS that corresponds with it, and then everything gets pre-rendered, including a snapshot of the dynamic app, and then that is sent down to the clients, and as well as the bundled version of the dynamic app. So when the script runs, it's going to basically run on the choose your flights thing, but everything else is pre-rendered, and you get a snapshot of that. So there were essentially some problems with the current solution, which is Angular 1, where the sign-up page will have a flash because it doesn't have a snapshot of the application, and that is the dynamic content, right? And one of the benefits of Angular 2 is that it's like fractal architecture. That usually means that can compose on each other. So to simply get a snapshot of the application, your index page becomes an Angular 2 component, and all you have to do is include the application in the directives array, just as we normally would. and then when we pre-render it, we'll get a snapshot of the whole application without much effort. And that's like the fractal architecture. Angular 2 is doing that with components.
So does it mean that you can make pre-rendering work with restricted access of your website? If the user has to log in to see this part of your website, does it work with your solution?
Are you saying that you want to maintain the current like page, but also like login?
So I have an example. One part of our web app uses what we call I don't remember links. You can save the link of the web page that you're on, and it saves all the parameters of this web page so that you can share the link with other users. But you have to be logged in to see this page. So if you try to use the link, you get redirected to the login page. Would it work to pre-render this page?
So you could pre-render the page, but if it's highly coupled with user data, then I mean you shouldn't, unless you're totally fine with, because if you could pre-render everything and put it in on a CDN, but then that is public, right? There's no way to really restrict that other than saying that, other than restricting at the router level of checking the cookies or whatnot to see if they are able to use it. But then if you're using that, then you're losing the benefit of a CDN. So there's trade-offs of everything, right? Like so for something like that, you could, so long as you're okay with that kind of a restriction. So yeah, so you could even do the other approach where you're isolating majority of the application, pre-render everything except the dynamic bits that pertains to the user, and then you would just bootstrap those widgets. So you could say like the whole thing is pre-rendered except the login part, and that's a separate widget. So when they get the page, they essentially have the pre-rendered application, but the dynamic bit is an Angular 2 component. And then that gets bootstrapped, and then it checks like who's logged in and whatnot, and then it'll show the correct user, right? And then if they click anywhere, they're just going to, going to do another re-render because they're making a request to the server. But you could also wrap the links into the router and then essentially lazy load the application from there. So there's a ton of advanced stuff. Now this is something that I'm working with Capital One to do as well, where you lazy load, because it's, well, this is it. For them, it's different lines of business where you want to lazy load other businesses. Your approach is, can we have a separate page that has like some context of a user that's dynamic but also pre-rendered? So yeah, you could do that, but you can do a lot of things. It's just a lot of work and effort, and remembering how the technologies work.
You can, but my general guideline is that if you need to have something server rendered that's like user specific, generally you do need just to have the re-rendering, like to dynamically be done. To try to like pre-render that's tough. But the one thing you mentioned, Olivier, with like redirects, like redirect for a given request if, like, let's say they aren't logged in or something like that. You can do that with pre-rendering with like a proxy. So like if you set up a proxy in between that everything gets routed to, and you put the logic there for doing like dynamic redirects. I've seen that work pretty effectively. But anyway, so we are more than halfway through the show. We haven't dove into the details of like how the actual library works. So I want to do that. I just want to mention for the people watching that if you do have a question for anybody here, you can tweet with the hashtag NGAIR, N-G-A-I-R, and we'll get to it near the end of the show. So let's talk about the details of how this actually works. So there's kind of two main parts. There's a couple other parts too we'll talk about, but there's the core universal library and then pre-boot. So Patrick, why don't you start off talking about the core universal library and how that actually works?
Yeah, so the universal library is more like a collection of helpers or other like modules that we're creating to help you with server-side rendering. So it includes something like an Express engine and a Happy engine, and we even created a Gulp plugin and even a Grunt plugin if people still use that. Like it's pretty much just helpers for like pre-rendering as well as re-rendering. Re-rendering being like Express or Happy, but the universal module itself essentially consolidates like the different approaches of it consolidates code that we could reuse within all of these integrations, but also it has logic that allows us to essentially grab the Angular 2 application and then essentially bootstrap it, as well as wait for all the requests to be done. So when Angular 2 is stable, then re-render it, or then serialize the document and send that down. The other thing is that on any other like server rendering like approach, they have a problem with capturing all the requests, and that is essentially we could take advantage of Zone.js, and whenever the application bootstraps, say you make HTTP calls throughout your application, we're able to track that with Zone.js and determine whenever they're all done before rendering. Now, on any other solution that does universal, that's like impossible because they don't use Zone.js. But the other approach with universal is that we could take advantage of a dependency injection, and that is to say, like at the top level of your application, we have a bootstrap file, and the bootstrap file basically requires your top level app, which is usually app, and then inside that file we essentially, which is the entry file, we include all the like platform specific like services. And so on the server, we created a node version of HTTP, a node version of the router location, and a node version of everything that you would want to need. At the entry file, that's where you would use it. But inside your application, it's interacting with the tokens of what is representing the backend. So if you're familiar with Angular 1's HTTP backend as well as mock HTTP backend, it's the same exact approach. We use that where rather than HTTP backend, we replace it with node version, so it works on the server. But you interact with the token, which is HTTP. So that means essentially the app folder and everything in it, that is universal and can be reused on server clients and WebWorker. But we have one entry file that basically imports and swap out the tokens for different environments. So that's kind of like how like a universal application works. And if you're making like directives, you would interact with the renderer, and then server, because we are using the server version of the renderer, it's going to ensure that everything works with our version of the document.
So there's actually three really big, really important things with what you mentioned that I want to actually go back to and sort of emphasize. So the first one being the core of Angular 2 itself that allows for all this to exist in the first place. So one thing I wanted to point out is that, you know, a lot of the heavy lifting to get Universal working actually wasn't done by Patrick or I. It was Tobias and some of the other core team members in the actual guts of Angular 2 itself. They built it in an extendable way so that it wasn't tied to the DOM, so that you can build any sort of rendering engine that you can just build on top of a sort of core framework to render out to anything. And that's allowed, for example, native script implementation to render to mobile, different other implementations, all sorts of different stuff that people are starting to build on top of Angular 2. And that is like web workers, yes, another big one. You know, so that is one of the biggest, most powerful things with Angular 2, this sort of extensibility and this dynamic rendering engine. The second thing that you mentioned is the DI. And actually, one thing I wanted to kind of emphasize, you know, with that's really interesting is that dependency management is sort of the name of the game with universal apps. Like when you're trying to run something in different contexts, the hardest part about that is how you abstract out the specific dependencies for that environment. And there are sort of two major approaches that I've seen. So one is the one that Angular is doing with DI, and the other, if it's not DI, yeah, you can do a swapping out of modules, like a build time with like Webpack. That's a similar type of approach. But then there's also a different thing, like a functional approach, where you start off with all your dependencies at the top level and you kind of pass them down within the functions. That is kind of pure functional approach. And to be honest, I've yet to see, although functional programming is great, I totally love functional programming. I have yet to see the implementation of a pure functional programming, full stack JavaScript app that is rather large, not just like a toy app. And that's because as your app grows larger, doing something with universal is extremely tough. Whereas with DI, at least I found that it becomes a lot simpler. And the other aspect to that is also specifically for the server side, it's difficult to get the context sometimes. Like, for example, like who's the active user on the server side? Like if you're deep into some particular like utility, you either pass the active user into it, or otherwise there's no way to get that context, or no easy way. But when you have a DI bootstrap at the request level, which we do with Universal, you can set what for that given request is, like Patrick was mentioning, all the different tokens. Like here's the URL for this request, here's the user for this request, all this different stuff, and then it's very easy to access anywhere else in your app. I mentioned a couple different things. I have like two more big ones, but what were you going to mention about that, Patrick?
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty much. I think you could. The third thing is talking about preboot, and you created that one, so you should definitely talk about the huge benefits of that.
Yeah, and actually, one more thing before talking about preboot. You mentioned zones, and I just wanted to point out, and you did mention this, but I don't think maybe it's appreciated enough, like how powerful zones are. That dealing with async on the server side is extremely hard, like when it comes to server rendering. And when you look at all the other server rendering solutions out there, they have different approaches. The one that I've seen the most frequently is that they force the server side to be synchronous. They don't allow asynchronous to occur because it's hard to manage. Like, how do you know on the server side when something is done? So zones actually provide like an unbelievably great abstraction and elegant to capture that we know that all these async actions occur during this request, and then the universal engine can wait until they return and then pass it back. And the one caveat with that is that you could theoretically, I don't know, like put like a loop, like in recursive loop calling set timeouts or whatever. So just because we don't want to like get into this like situation where it like just waits forever, we do have it set to do like one tick, basically like one series of asynchronous calls. So if you have more than that, then that won't be captured without additional configuration. I'm right on that part, Patrick, right? It does one tick?
Yeah, so like another thing about Zone.js is that like there's a lot of, like even with testing, and we spoke about this in the previous episode, in testing you definitely have problems with asynchronous code, and that is like waiting for everything to be done before saying your test is done. So we both utilize Zone.js to track when the calls are done, when the application is stable, before saying the test is done, or before we're saying rendering, you should render. And presumably this is exactly what Google was doing with the Google crawlers, which has now been depreciated, when they were capturing JavaScript, they were probably waiting until the CPU is idle before saying it's done, or they're probably doing a ton of other fancy things. But what you mentioned, essentially, if someone was using like a set interval for polling reasons, then that would totally like break everything because something's always running.
Wait, it's depreciated? I didn't even realize that. Is that true?
Yeah, it's appreciated. Basically, we created our universal solution, and then they're like, well, we don't need it anymore.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wait, so the crawler is not going to do client-side rendering, is what you're saying?
Yeah, they're going to either slowly remove it or remove it altogether eventually.
Well, then that makes universal even more important, right?
Yeah.
Actually, I'm not sure about that, Patrick. If you read the article that you linked, they say that you don't need to do Ajax URLs with dash stuff, but you can do whatever you want, and it will just crawl it the way you want. So I don't think they will remove this. It would be a bit stupid on their part.
Yeah, that would be crazy. We'll see. Okay, it was something to I guess look up after this a little bit more. Okay, so pre-boot. I do want to mention that before we kind of get to some of the final topics. So one thing we realized as we started building out the core universal engine is that we run into a problem that you have this server rendered view that appears almost instantaneously, and the user might interact with the page before the client bootstraps. So the client bootstrapping may take, depending on the speed of your connection and other factors, could take 5-6 seconds, anything like that. Without server rendering, the user doesn't see anything until that it finishes. But with server rendering, the typical scenario is that they'll see something under a second, if you do everything correctly, and then the client kicks in 5 seconds, just 6 seconds. I don't know, it depends, depending on how big your app is and that type of thing. So in that gap, the 4-5 second gap, users can do a lot actually, and people, from having tens of thousands of people come to Get Human every day, we see it, how quickly people just start clicking around. They'll actually come from a Google search, click all sort of 10 different things, and then hit the back button before the client-side app even loads. Like that happens, fairly frequently. So
that sounds like a bot.
Well, I could be too, sure. But people do this as well. And so to deal with the situation, even if it's not like 5 different things, just even one thing, it could provide a poor user experience. So to deal with this, we created this library called Preboot, which basically records events. It gets included with the server rendered content, so it's there immediately, just a very small piece of JavaScript, and all it's doing is recording all of the clicks, all of the mouse movements, whatever else occurs on that page to whatever element. And then when the client finishes bootstrapping, it replays those events to the now active client code. And this is something that does not exist in any other solution other than Angular 2 with Bootstrap. It is built, Preboot is built so that it actually could theoretically work with any library, but right now it's only integrated with Angular 2. And it does this in a way so that you, for example, see the page, might start typing into a text box, and the client side kicks in, and it's just seamless. Like the user just see, like if let's say you were in a text box that was showing an autocomplete, the all the keyboard strokes would be passed into the actual client view. It would do the searches, etc. once the client bootstraps, and the user would see, then their autocomplete like drop down, as soon as the client kicks in. And there's other aspects to this, but that's sort of the basic gist. Was there something, Patrick, you wanted to add to that?
No, I think you covered pretty much a lot of it. Basically, that the server sends down the initial view, and then there's a gap between the view, which have inputs or whatever, and the client application that hooks up JavaScript to the view. And in that gap, essentially preboot allows the application to work in that environment in a way where if a user, remember this is like milliseconds, right? And a lot of people have been avoiding like any sort of input fields or anything inside the initial render because of this problem. But with preboot, you're able to track all the events. So like if someone has a to-do list and they type in something, and in that 1 to 2 milliseconds, if you don't have preboot, then whatever you typed will be removed. But with preboot, it ensures that whatever they typed is still there when the client bootstraps.
Can you use preboot with anything else than Angular Universal? Let's say you want to record an end-to-end scenario. You can do that with preboot and replay it, maybe?
Yep. Yeah, so, well, two aspects to that. Number one, it's really easy to use it with something other than Angular as well. You can use it with Angular 1, in fact. We created an adaptation to be able to use it with some of the Get Human stuff that we're doing. But besides that, it's also fully extensible and customizable over what type of events you're listening for and what happens in how you replay them, or if you have some sort of interim thing that you do. So like the terms that we have are within the preboot libraries, there's different strategies for listening, replaying, and freeze events or interim events. So the listening is just an algorithm for what and how it listens to things. So there's a default one basically that's built into the library, but you can easily override it if you had your own kind of way of how you want to and what you want to listen to. And then for the interim events, that's like if the most clear example of that is if you click on a button. Typically with clicking on a button, you do want to wait until the client bootstraps, and most of the time you don't want the user to do anything else because clicking on a button typically means that like the form's been submitted, you're doing something else bigger. So we do have something like just kind of as a default that if you click on a button, it sort of freezes the screen, like it puts on an overlay and like spinner type of thing. Just because that's like the most common scenario, but you don't necessarily need that. You can replace that with some other behavior, whatever is needed for your app. And then the replay events, there's a specific way that Angular 2 loads elements on the page, and that is slightly different to how, let's say, React does or some other framework. So the replay events, the default strategy, is in line with how Angular 2 loads elements on the page, and it can find, for example, the client-side rendered element versus the server side, whereas other frameworks might do it slightly differently. And so just one aside there is that I am working with some other developers in trying to see how using preboot essentially by itself almost, or with just plain old JavaScript. So hopefully we'll have something for that in the next kind of couple months that might be interesting. Okay. Oh, did you have something else, Olivier?
Nope.
Okay. So let's get to what is left. So we talked a little bit about the core library itself. We're near the top of the show. But I think the key thing that people are interested in is when is this ready for use in production? When is the full release? And at a general level, what I've been telling people is that we're trying to have everything done by the time that Angular 2 is in full release. But maybe Patrick, you want to talk about what are the specific things that are still left to do for us to feel comfortable saying that this is completely production ready?
Yeah, there's some System.js issues that we had to resolve, there's a ton of documentation that needs to be there. A lot of problems that people run into is just because there's a lack of documentation explaining that you have to create directives that only interact with the renderer, as opposed to like grabbing like a document, assume it's global, or like location, assume it's global. So basically that, a lot of documentation, and like critical like third-party services, and like location, like location, and standardizing the interface for like local storage and interacting with cookies. So basically, yeah.
There's a lot of stuff that we've seen as you and I have been building things out, and others that are just every one of us have run into the same things. That okay, we need an SEO service, we need all these other things. So like that's the type of thing you're talking about that we're starting to standardize, we're trying to standardize.
Yeah, so providing a better contract with like third-party libraries as well as the developer, where they interact with essentially like how I mentioned that there's HTTP and then there's backend and mock. Basically saying that if your code is testable in that kind of approach, with like you're interacting with the HTTP but there's backend and mock, so long as it's that, then it could be supported with Universal, because we could just swap out, or the developer can create their own on the fly version of the mock backend or node backend, and then you essentially get universal support by default, so long as you follow like very small like best practices.
Hey,
And
by
so
the way,
long as
go ahead.
and so long as we create the contract with the tokens, so basically saying like for per each environment you're able to utilize this token. So token as in like DI token, where there's HTTP, and then there's probably going to be a window token and document token where you could inject those globals. And so long as you interact with that, which we normally do in Angular 1 with $window, so long as you do that, then yeah, that's pretty much the thing that we have to push, is the standard for that.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we're going to have a set of interfaces, right? That like you use some good examples. Another one is authenticated user, or whatever we're going to end up calling it. That there'll just be a standard interface for how you access that, because it's just needed for most people who build apps, and you need to be able to have a common way in which the universal server side and client side kind of hook into the same thing. And
and it's interesting because Angular 2, more so than Angular 1, it's coupled by interfaces. So at any time you can swap out anything. So if you have a bug in your code because of some Angular 2 internal thing, in Angular 1 you have to like submit a pull request and wait. In Angular 2 you could just swap that out with your own fix, and then just move on and then submit a pull request or an issue saying that this is a problem. And I did that like many times throughout the Angular 2 beta and alpha releases. So it's because it's coupled by interfaces, it's introducing the hexagonal architecture where you're interacting with the interface of everything, and allows your code to be a lot more modular. And we take advantage of this with universal code. And that's the patterns that we're kind of advocating with server-side rendering and universal, is that if you follow this small approach, this small contract of just dealing with interfaces, not like TypeScript interfaces where you have to create an interface for everything, just saying that like for this particular class you interacted, you can guarantee that that these methods exist, and because of that guarantee, we could hook into stuff like that and swap out pieces and have everything still work.
One thing you just made me realize too is that we mentioned use cases earlier in the show for Universal. Actually, one thing that we did not talk about, and I actually haven't even been leveraging that much, but I think is eventually going to become a thing, is using the server-side rendering piece for testing out components, basically, because you don't. It's always, like we talked about in the last episode with Julie, it's so much faster, more reliable, better if you're running your tests on the server side. You don't have to spin up a browser or anything like that. And so if you can test your component and actually have it spit out static HTML that you're testing, that's what people in the React world do a lot, actually. And that is something that we can do with Universal. That actually is one of the ways that you can test your components.
Yeah, so you could essentially almost think of it as removing the end-to-end step, or at least pushing it later. So you could be a lot more agile by saying that for the most part, your tests are going to be running with the universal server-side implementation of the document, which is a fake document, and you could utilize that and push the actual browser environment thing towards end of the day or something like that. So you could be a lot more agile. It's a lot more faster to have your tests run. Yeah.
And then the last two things you didn't mention that we are trying to get in there, but not necessarily huge deals, is multi-app support. So basically, the ability to have many different applications running at the same time. So there is built within Angular 2 the ability to do this. You run different Angular 2 apps at the same time. And that works, but having it work on both the client and the server with pre-boot, everything like that. So we're still trying to get some of those things worked out. And then performance-wise, it is fairly performant now, but there's actually a lot more that we can do. And we want to, sort of the litmus test for me actually is that I need this solution to be at least as performant as my Angular 1 solution, which we are still have a couple things that we're working on. In particular, actually, in core, they are close to landing a change which will allow you to pre-compile your templates, which is different than pre-rendering that Patrick talked about earlier. Pre-compiling your templates essentially is just a build step process where it takes your Angular 2 app and it builds these artifacts that you would still run at runtime, but it's just a more efficient way of doing that. And that is going to, those precompiled templates are much easier to, for example, share among multiple requests, like one thing I alluded to before. So that is, actually, Patrick, do you know when that is supposed to be landing?
I mean, we can't say anything for sure. I mean, it could be tonight, tomorrow, next month.
Sure.
Essentially, the precompiled step, that's saying that your string template, we're going to turn it into a factory function that outputs essentially what the compiler is doing, and then it allows us to remove the compiler code from essentially the your Angular 2 bundle, right? So they're doing the same thing with CSS as well. So you could think of it as getting something like uncss, which is essentially a service to remove CSS that you're not using. So you get something like that for free whenever you do something like even more crazy advanced stuff like tree shaking, where you essentially remove stuff that you're not using. So there's a lot of benefits of pre-compiling the whole application and converting all those strings into JavaScript, and then shipping that. So that's another performance gain that is going to be on the horizon.
Okay, and we're past our time, but the last thing I wanted to mention, looking to the future, is that after, and this is not for the initial release, but just so for kind of on the to-do list for the future, we are eventually going to integrate Universal with non-Node.js backends. Steve Sanderson, who is going to be on next week, has already done this with .NET, so he has an integration between .NET and Angular Universal, which is really, really awesome. We're essentially going to do the same thing with PHP, with Java for sure, and then there's a couple other ones that people are talking about, Python, maybe some other ones. So we'll see about those, but that's sort of further down the road. There's other caching stuff, other crazy stuff that we definitely don't have time to get into, but a lot of stuff kind of on the horizon. So let's, and if you want to learn more, I guess the way to finish this is that Patrick and I are going to be at ngConf. We're both giving a talk which we're going to get into. It's focused on patterns. If you're building a production universal app, what are kind of the common patterns that you should follow? And then we are also doing a workshop. So if you're actually at the ngConf, you'll get a chance to sign up for our workshop, and we'll help you build a universal app for the second day of the conference. So, anything else you guys wanted to bring up on the panel? Okay, great. Let's get to picks, and let's start off with Ari.
All right. Let's see. I think I did this once before. We launched another big section of fullstackreact.com if you are writing React apps. And I am kind of a little bit in the Lambda architecture. You probably could have guessed that based on my comment earlier. Serverless.com is a really neat implementation of a framework built on Lambda, on AWS Lambda.
That's cool. Yeah, I've been interested in Lambda. I'm definitely going to check that out. Thanks. Olivier.
Our friends of UI Router just released Alpha 1 of 1.00 of UI Router, so that's probably a library that you use if you do Angular 1. You should check it out, help them find out the bugs, because once this release is done, they can focus on Angular 2 and UI Router for Angular 2. So please help them finish this one, and let's have fun with UI Router. And the other part is I wanted to say that all my libraries on GitHub are unpublished proof. So you don't have to worry about me unpublishing my libs. I will deprecate them if I don't use them anymore. But don't worry, I will never unpublish them.
Nice.
And that.
Nice. And yeah, that is an important one to have. I think Gleb tweeted about that earlier. I like the not being able to unpublish thing. All right, Wasim. Go ahead.
I have a quick pick for folks who want to dive deep into Universal. Patrick has made a video on Read the Source about Universal. So we'll post the link on Twitter so you can check it out.
I mean, I know Patrick is the star, but I was actually on that video as well.
Oh, sorry.
No. He definitely did the majority of the talking there, so that was cool. Patrick.
Yeah, so my two picks are conferences, ngConf and Angular Connect. Definitely don't miss. They're going to be pretty huge. Yeah.
Cool. I have just one pick, and I haven't plugged Get Human. I can remember, maybe early on, I mentioned one thing because we've been in such a build mode for so long, but we finally released, had a huge release last week that has a lot of the stuff that I've been working on for a long time. And so I want to plug Get Human. Basically, if you have a customer service problem that you need to call pretty much any company within bigger company within the US, definitely go to Get Human first, and we can either give you shortcuts through the phone maze, the ability to get through without waiting on hold, or if you just want us to deal with it, you can just pay us and we'll handle the entire problem. So definitely check that out if you want to avoid the painful process that is most customer service at most companies. So
yeah, I use Get Human. I use it a few times. Whenever I'm dealing with Comcast, my ISP, or anything, definitely I just use it.
Telecoms are the worst.
Yep.
All right, thanks for everyone. Definitely, you can send us questions. Patrick or I tweet us if you have any questions, and we can definitely get back to you. Otherwise, NGConf is going to be the next big update, so tune in for that. All right, talk to you later.
Cool. Bye,
Bye.
guys.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.